They erased the feminine from the story and left only the masculine. But what if I told you that patriarchy wasn't the natural order of human civilization? What if the dominance of masculine energy over feminine energy was a relatively recent historical development imposed through systematic suppression, not evolutionary inevitability? What I am about to show you reveals how the suppression of feminine principle wasn't just about controlling women. It was about destroying the natural balance that kept communities, healthy spiritual traditions intact and power distributed rather than concentrated. Matriarchal societies weren't primitive anomalies. They were sophisticated civilizations that thrived for thousands of years. The archaeological record shows numerous cultures where women held political, spiritual, and economic authority alongside or instead of men. The Iroquois Confederacy operated under a system where clan mothers chose chiefs and could remove them if they didn't serve community interests. Women controlled property inheritance, made decisions about war and peace, and held ultimate authority in governance structures. In ancient Crete, the Minoan civilization flourished for over 1,000 years, with goddess-centered spirituality and evidence suggesting significant female leadership in both religious and secular spheres. Their art depicts women in positions of authority and spiritual significance. Pre-colonial West African societies like the Kingdom of Dahomey had female regiments, women traders who controlled major markets, and spiritual systems that honored feminine deities as creators and sustainers of life. These weren't exceptions. They were examples of civilizational models that recognized feminine energy as essential for community balance, spiritual connection, and sustainable governance. The suppression of feminine principle began systematically with the rise of monotheistic religions that replaced goddess-centered spirituality with male-only divine authority. This wasn't theological evolution, it was political strategy. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism positioned male deities as supreme while demonizing or erasing feminine divine aspects. Goddess temples were destroyed, feminine spiritual practices were criminalized, and women's roles in spiritual leadership were systematically eliminated. Colonial expansion accelerated this suppression globally. European colonizers encountered indigenous societies with balanced gender roles and feminine spiritual authority, then imposed patriarchal structures through force and legal systems. The witch trials weren't about supernatural beliefs. They were systematic campaigns to eliminate women who held knowledge, property, or influence that threatened emerging patriarchal power structures. Midwives, healers, and women with property were targeted specifically to concentrate power in male-dominated institutions. This suppression wasn't limited to spiritual and political spheres. It extended to economics, medicine, and education, systematically removing women from positions of knowledge and authority they had held for millennia. Feminine knowledge systems were targeted for destruction because they represented alternative ways of understanding reality that couldn't be controlled by emerging patriarchal institutions. Women's healing traditions, herbal medicine, and understanding of natural cycles were labeled as witchcraft and superstition, then replaced by male-dominated medical systems that divorced healing from natural processes and community knowledge. Feminine spiritual practices that emphasized direct connection with natural forces, intuitive wisdom, and collective decision-making were replaced by hierarchical religious systems that required institutional intermediaries and discouraged personal spiritual authority. Women's economic networks, craft guilds, and trading relationships that operated on cooperative principles were dismantled and replaced by competitive systems that concentrated wealth in male-controlled institutions. The destruction wasn't just about eliminating women's power. It was about eliminating entire ways of organizing society that balanced individual and collective needs, integrated spiritual and material concerns, and maintained sustainable relationships with natural systems. The suppression of feminine principle created psychological programming that extends far beyond gender roles. It established the dominance of analytical over intuitive thinking, competition over cooperation, and exploitation over sustainability. Qualities associated with feminine energy, intuition, empathy, cooperation, cyclical thinking, emotional intelligence, were devalued as weak or irrational, while qualities associated with masculine energy, logic, competition, linear thinking, emotional suppression, were elevated as strong and rational. This created internal conflicts in both men and women. who were taught to suppress aspects of their own nature to conform to artificial gender limitations. Men were taught to reject their intuitive and empathetic capacities, while women were taught to distrust their analytical and assertive abilities. The imbalance extended to social structures, economic systems, and environmental relationships. Societies organized around masculine principle alone tend toward hierarchy, accumulation, and dominance rather than balance, sustainability, and cooperation. The suppression of feminine principle is directly connected to ecological destruction because feminine energy represents the receptive, nurturing, cyclical aspects of natural systems, while masculine energy represents the active, generating, linear aspects. Indigenous cultures that maintained balance between masculine and feminine principles developed sustainable relationships with natural systems that lasted thousands of years. They understood that taking, masculine, must be balanced with giving back, feminine, that growth must be balanced with rest, that action must be balanced with receptivity. The domination of masculine principle created cultures that emphasized taking without giving back, growth without sustainability, action without reflection. This imbalance manifests as resource extraction, environmental degradation, and climate disruption. Restoring balance between masculine and feminine principles isn't just about gender equality. It's about recovering ways of thinking and organizing that can create sustainable relationships with the natural systems we depend on for survival. Despite systematic suppression, feminine wisdom traditions survived underground through secret practices, folk knowledge, and cultural transmission that bypassed official institutions. Midwifery, herbal healing, and women's mysteries continued through informal networks that preserved knowledge about natural cycles, plant medicine, and body wisdom that institutional medicine ignored or criminalized. Goddess spirituality, earth-based practices, and feminine-centered rituals maintained connections to natural forces and cyclical time that patriarchal religions attempted to sever. Women's economic cooperatives, mutual aid networks, and alternative trading systems preserved models of resource sharing and collective decision-making that challenged hierarchical economic structures. These underground traditions maintained not just feminine knowledge but alternative ways of organizing community life that balanced individual and collective needs, integrated spiritual and practical concerns, and sustained rather than depleted natural systems. The current global crises, ecological destruction, social inequality, mental health epidemics, spiritual disconnection, are symptoms of the imbalance created by suppressing feminine principle for centuries. Restoring balance doesn't mean replacing masculine dominance with feminine dominance. It means integrating both energies in ways that serve life rather than destroying it. This applies to individuals, relationships, communities, and civilizations. For individuals, it means developing both analytical and intuitive capacities, both assertive and receptive abilities, both linear and cyclical thinking patterns. It means healing the internal splits created by patriarchal programming. For communities, it means creating governance structures that balance hierarchy with cooperation, economic systems that balance growth with sustainability, and spiritual practices that honor both transcendent and immanent aspects of divinity. The feminine principle rising doesn't threaten healthy masculinity. It complements it. But it does threaten systems built on imbalance, exploitation, and unsustainable dominance. The mother never left. She was driven underground, but her wisdom preserved itself through generations of women who remembered, through natural systems that continued operating on cyclical principles, through intuitive knowledge that couldn't be completely destroyed. The feminine principle is rising again not as revenge against masculine energy, but as restoration of the balance necessary for survival and thriving. This isn't about gender war. It's about healing the splits that have created individual suffering and collective crisis. Both masculine and feminine energies are sacred, necessary, and powerful. The goal isn't dominance by either but partnership between both, creating individuals and societies that can think and feel, act and receive, create and nurture in balanced integration. Drop balance if you recognize that healing the world requires healing the split between masculine and feminine energies within ourselves and our communities.